What if I told you that Canada, a nation often seen as a steadfast friend and trading partner, just dealt an unexpected blow that could reshape the American auto industry for years to come? Picture this: prices on new cars inching higher by the week, dealerships cutting back on promotional deals, and factories laying off workers they had desperately tried to hold on to. The industries in the crosshairs aren't just steel and aluminum anymore. Tesla and the entire electric vehicle sector could be staring down a supply chain nightmare. For decades, the United States imposed tariffs on Canadian goods, from dairy to softwood lumber. Canadian officials typically responded with carefully worded criticisms or minor countermeasures, never pushing too far. But the latest wave of U.S. tariffs turned out to be the last straw. In retaliation, Canada abruptly announced its own set of tariffs, catching American car makers off guard and leaving many to wonder if this could be the start of a massive realignment in North American manufacturing. The stakes are enormous, and not just for companies like Ford, General Motors, or Tesla. This dispute ripples through every corner of the country, from family-owned suppliers in the Midwest to tech startups developing the next generation of electric drivetrains. Whether you're an auto enthusiast or just someone in the market for a new ride, this story is about far more than steel and aluminum prices. It's about the future of one of America's most iconic industries, and how an often overlooked neighbor just might hold the winning cards. Canada's retaliatory tariffs may have landed suddenly, but they weren't born out of thin air. For years, the U.S. levied trade barriers on Canadian products, citing everything from national security concerns to protecting American jobs. In many cases, Canada grumbled but complied, hoping diplomacy would eventually lead to more balanced agreements. But every time it seemed tensions might ease, another round of restrictive policies or tariffs came down from Washington. When Canada unveiled its latest set of tariffs, 10% on U.S. energy exports and a hefty 25% on American steel and aluminum, the shock was immediate. Economists scrambled to understand the true scope of the measures, and automakers realized the blow would be especially brutal. It wasn't just one tariff in isolation. It was the synergy of multiple cost increases. Think of it like stacking weights on a single beam until it's bound to crack. The auto industry, already dealing with pandemic-related disruptions and shifting consumer preferences, found itself at a breaking point. Why steel and aluminum? Because modern cars, whether they run on gas or electricity, require metals at nearly every stage of construction. Frames, body panels, and engine components all depend on affordable access to these materials. Historically, the U.S. has sourced a large portion of its steel and aluminum from Canada due to proximity and favorable trade terms. By flipping the script, Canada forced car companies to reconsider the very underpinnings of their production strategy. Then there's energy, a subtle but massive factor. The U.S. might have multiple suppliers for steel and aluminum, but reliable sources of oil, gas, and electricity aren't as easy to reroute. Canada targeted these exports precisely because shutting them off or making them more expensive would wreak havoc in American factories, especially those operating on thin margins. Suddenly, the cost of firing up a plant in Michigan or Ohio could spike, potentially canceling out the benefits of being located in the U.S. to begin with. It's one thing to talk about tariffs in abstract terms. It's another to see the effect where it hurts most, at the dealership. The truth is, most car buyers are unaware of how many cross-border transactions go into building each vehicle. Parts crisscross back and forth multiple times, from raw metal processing to the final assembly. When one border checkpoint suddenly demands higher fees or complex paperwork, every stage of production takes a hit. Dealerships usually get a twofold squeeze. First, their wholesale costs go up. Automakers pass down the increased expense of metals and energy to the dealerships in the form of higher vehicle prices. Second, they can't advertise the same promotional deals they used to. If a dealership tries to keep prices artificially low, they risk selling cars at a loss. Ultimately, the customer either pays more or the dealership sells fewer cars, with both options hurting the overall health of the automotive market. For consumers, even a small price jump can be the difference between buying that new SUV or waiting another year. Monthly payments rise, interest rates factor in, and customers begin comparing other brands or even other modes of transportation. Some might look at public transit or ride sharing, especially if they live in urban areas. But in much of the US, especially suburban and rural regions, people rely heavily on personal vehicles. By making cars more expensive, the tariffs ripple out to affect everything from daily commutes to how families plan vacations and large purchases. Most discussions about tariffs center on traditional car makers, big names like Ford or GM. But Tesla, the poster child for American automotive innovation, feels these tariffs in particularly painful ways. While gas-powered cars are heavily dependent on steel and aluminum, electric vehicles have an even more specialized appetite for raw materials. Nickel, lithium, and high-quality aluminum are crucial for building EV batteries and structural components. Canada, with its extensive mining operations and resource network, provides a significant slice of this supply. When Tesla realized that tariffs could spike the cost of sourcing these minerals, it faced a daunting choice: either absorb the added cost or pass it on to consumers. Absorbing it squeezes profit margins that are already tight, especially with Tesla's ongoing investments in new factories and product lines. Passing it on, however, risks alienating customers who have grown accustomed to the idea that EV prices will gradually decline to match gasoline equivalents. Then there's the matter of production logistics. Even if Tesla wanted to find alternative sources for these raw materials, doing so isn't straightforward. Contracts with suppliers often last years, with complex clauses for volume, quality, and delivery schedules. Shifting supply chains can mean renegotiating deals, testing new materials, or building relationships with entirely different mining companies, often located halfway around the globe. That kind of overhaul doesn't happen overnight, leaving Tesla in a precarious position where each passing month of tariffs chips away at its near-term goals. Meanwhile, competitors, both domestic and foreign, look on with interest. Ford and GM have their own EV ambitions, but they're similarly reliant on Canadian minerals. Foreign automakers in Europe and Asia, however, might sidestep some of these issues if they source materials differently or sign new deals with Canada. In a world race for EV dominance, any supply chain disruption can tilt the playing field, creating openings for rivals to catch up or surge ahead. Anytime you talk about the auto industry in America, you end up talking about the communities that revolve around it. Places like Detroit, Flint, Toledo, and Youngstown have lived through the highs and lows of manufacturing for decades. Whenever the auto market booms, they thrive. When it contracts, they crumble. Tariffs might sound like political jargon, but for the people on the ground, it translates into shifts being cut, factories halting expansions, or temporary layoffs turning permanent. Imagine you've worked in an assembly plant for 20 years, secure in your role of installing parts on the line. Suddenly, your boss announces that production is slowing due to supply chain interruptions or pricing pressures from new tariffs. Maybe you're told you can come back in a few weeks if business picks up again. But in that gap, how do you pay the mortgage or maintain health insurance? Multiply that scenario by thousands, and you get a sense of the social ripple effect these tariffs create. Local businesses also feel the strain. Diners that serve factory workers lose lunch customers. Hardware stores see fewer weekend DIY projects. Schools worry about declining tax revenue if residents move away in search of better opportunities. It's a grim cycle that many thought had finally ended as the auto industry rebounded in recent years. Now tariffs threaten to unravel that fragile stability, forcing communities to confront the possibility that their mini recovery might have been short-lived. Beyond metals, Canada's biggest leverage lies in energy. The US might turn to other countries for steel or aluminum, albeit at a higher cost, but replacing Canadian oil, gas, or electricity isn't so simple. Many states, from those in the Northeast reliant on Quebec's hydropower to Midwestern states that process Canadian crude, depend on a steady flow of Canadian energy to keep their economies humming. If Canada raises export fees or imposes quotas, energy prices could spike dramatically. Think of the immediate effect at the gas pump, where consumers are notoriously sensitive to even a few pennies of increase. Now imagine that spike in states heavily reliant on cross-border energy for industrial operations. factories would pay more to power equipment, raising production costs yet again and further pushing car prices upward. Of course, Canada also risks shooting itself in the foot by restricting energy exports. Oil and gas form a significant chunk of the Canadian economy, and any major shakeup in trade with the US could lead to temporary revenue losses or force Canada to scramble for new buyers. But in a prolonged standoff, that pain might be worth the political leverage it provides. If the US continues imposing aggressive tariffs on Canadian goods, Ottawa could reason that withholding energy is the only way to bring Washington to the table. As with any high-stakes dispute, rival powers watch from the sidelines, ready to capitalize. China has long sought stable sources of metals like nickel, lithium, and aluminum, essential to its electronics and EV industries. If the US-Canada relationship sours, China could strike investment deals that lock up Canada's natural resources for years, guaranteeing supplies at predictable costs. Such a shift would undercut American automakers further, as global competition for these resources heats up. European automakers, particularly those in Germany, have also invested heavily in EV technology. They need secure supplies of battery components to meet the EU's aggressive emissions targets. If they sense the US market is embroiled in a lengthy tariff dispute, it's an opportune moment to forge closer ties with Canada. Partnerships in mining, refining, and research could give European brands a strategic edge. Meanwhile, American companies might find themselves on the outside looking in. This isn't just an economic sideshow. It's a broader shift in how global supply chains function. Historically, the US held a privileged position thanks to geography and long-standing partnerships. Losing that edge could reshape the global auto industry. We might see a future where major breakthroughs in EV technology or battery research occur primarily in Europe or Asia, with America trailing in both manufacturing capacity and technological innovation. The American auto industry has always been about more than just cars. It symbolizes economic might, technological innovation, and a source of steady employment for millions of Americans. Now, it's staring down a challenge from a neighbor that many once viewed as too polite to push back. Canada's tariffs have laid bare the fragile underpinnings of cross-border supply chains, especially in an era where electric vehicles are poised to transform how we drive and build our roads. The real question is whether the US can afford a protracted standoff. Every day of higher costs and political uncertainty makes American cars less competitive, domestically and abroad. Tesla's ambition to bring electric cars to the masses is threatened by unstable material costs, and traditional manufacturers scramble to keep their gas-powered lines afloat while dabbling in EV production. Meanwhile, entire towns and cities built on the bedrock of assembly lines wonder if another wave of layoffs is just around the corner. So the next time you walk onto a car lot and notice a price tag that seems higher than you expected, remember, this isn't just about supply and demand. It's about a broader power shift, one in which Canada just reminded the world that even smaller players can pack a mighty punch when pushed to the brink. Whether cooler heads prevail or the rift widens, the fate of the US auto industry, and by extension, a critical piece of the country's economic identity, will hang in the balance.